You think spending gets easier the more money you save. It doesn't. It gets harder. At $0, you'll spend your last 20 on a coffee without blinking. At 500,000, you'll sit in your car for 10 minutes deciding if a coffee is worth it. That's backwards from everything anyone ever told you about money growing up, and it's not really about the coffee at all. It's about what that number sitting in your account has quietly started protecting. I'm going to walk you through what spending actually feels like at every level of savings, from $0 to $500,000. And by the end, you'll understand why having enough never actually makes it easier. Picture this. You've got $60 left until payday, and you're standing in a grocery store aisle under fluorescent light. You grab the store brand cereal without reading the price. You don't compare it to the name brand 3 inches away. You don't hesitate. There's nothing to protect, because $60 can't move up or down in any way that changes your life either direction. It's already spent in your head before you even reach the register. That's not carelessness, and it's not discipline either. That's simply what money feels like with zero cushion behind it. Every dollar is already claimed by something bigger than a receipt, so the receipt itself stops mattering to you. Now picture a different version of you a few years later. You've got $18,000 sitting quietly in savings, and you're standing in front of a laptop you actually want and could genuinely use, doing math you never used to bother doing. Not can I afford this? A different question entirely. Does buying this undo 6 months of careful progress? You add it to the cart, then remove it, then add it back 3 separate times before you finally check out. The money itself didn't get smaller or less real. The fear did the opposite of shrinking. It found a job to do, and that job is protecting a number that simply didn't exist for you a year ago. And now, picture the version of you further along still. Dinner with friends, $400,000 sitting in a brokerage account. And you're the one running silent math, while everyone else just orders whatever looks good. Not can I afford the second bottle of wine? A much quieter question, one you'd never say out loud. What does skipping this actually save me in 10 years, compounded at market rate? You order it anyway, because refusing in front of people would look strange. But some part of you resents that you had to run the numbers at all, at this amount, at this table, with these people. Maybe you recognize yourself in more than one of these 3. Most people do, and that's exactly the point, and because this was never really about income or about willpower or about being careful with money. It's about what a saved number quietly starts guarding the moment it exists in your account, whether you notice it happening or not. Here's the part nobody explains to you. Pause 0 beat per 8. It's not the amount of money that decides how spending feels. It's what that amount is currently protecting you from. At 0, there's nothing to protect, so spending feels like relief. At 100,000, there's a milestone to protect, so spending feels like risk. At $500,000, there's an identity to protect, so spending feels like a threat to who you are, not just what you own. $0, 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 250,000, $500,000, 7 numbers, 7 separate versions of you, and 7 completely different reasons your hand hesitates over the exact same purchase, a coffee, a flight, a dinner you didn't really need to order. Most people assume this curve only moves in one direction. Less money, more anxiety about spending. More money, less anxiety about spending. A straight line, easing off as the number climbs. That's not what actually happens. The line bends back on itself. It gets easier for a while, somewhere in the middle, and then it gets harder again, right when you'd expect it to feel the safest. I'm going to walk you through all 7 of those numbers and the exact mechanism that switches on at each one. From the version of you with nothing in the bank to the version of you with $500,000 sitting quietly behind glass, watched over more carefully than anything you've ever owned. Somewhere in the next 15 minutes, you'll recognize exactly where you are right now, and you'll probably see, a little uncomfortably, exactly where you're headed next. This is why people who finally save real money almost never describe feeling free. Ask them directly, and most will say the opposite. Careful, sometimes to the point of paralysis, over purchases that would have meant nothing to them 5 years and 1 savings account ago. That's not a personality flaw showing up late in life, and it's not them becoming cheap. That's a mechanism, a specific and nameable one, switching on at a specific number, exactly the way a different mechanism switched on at the number before it. $0. This is where the mechanism starts, and it's not what you'd expect. You're at the checkout counter with your card, and you already know it's close to declining. Maybe within $20 or $30 of it, you buy the coffee anyway. You buy the small thing you didn't strictly need anyway. Not because you're bad with money, and not because you're careless by nature, because there's genuinely nothing left to protect. When an account is already at zero, or close enough to it that the difference is academic, one more small purchase doesn't change your actual risk in any way your brain can measure against anything. So the part of you built to measure that risk simply stops calculating altogether. This is reference collapse. Your mind manages financial risk by comparing any choice against a reference point. What you currently have, what you stand to lose if this goes wrong. At true zero, there is no usable reference point left to compare against. There's nothing to lose that you haven't, in some sense, already lost. So the internal alarm that normally slows you down before a purchase goes quiet, and spending starts to feel less like a decision you're making and more like a reflex, almost like a small relief valve opening. It's the one level on this entire staircase where spending genuinely feels easy, effortless even. And it's easy for the single worst possible reason: there's nothing left inside the number worth defending. The money consequence is brutal in its simplicity. With no reference point left to protect, small purchases accumulate with almost zero internal resistance, one after another, invisibly, and that's exactly how zero stays zero for years at a time, for psychological reasons that have almost nothing to do with how much someone actually earns. But the moment you save your first real dollar and it survives long enough to become a number you check on purpose, all of that changes completely. And it doesn't change gradually the way you'd expect. It changes the instant there's finally something small enough to lose. And your brain, which has been idle this whole time, wakes up almost immediately to start guarding it. $1,000. This is the first number that feels like it belongs to you, and that's exactly the problem. You open the banking app before bed now, out of habit rather than necessity, the way some people check the weather. The balance reads $1,040, and something in you relaxes slightly at the shape of that number. You close the app and decide the takeout order can wait until tomorrow, even though tomorrow changes literally nothing about your actual financial situation. It's not that the $10 matters on its own. It's that dropping back under $1,000, even for a single day, feels disproportionately like failing at something you just started to win. This is streak guarding. Once a number crosses a clean, round threshold for the first time in your life, your brain quietly stops treating it as money and starts treating it as a streak, a small winning number that must not go back down, run by the exact same circuitry that makes you not want to break a habit tracker or lose a game you were comfortably ahead in with minutes left. The actual dollar amount barely matters here at all. What matters is the shape of the number and the direction it's been moving lately. A round number you've genuinely never crossed before creates a finish line. Your brain flatly refuses to walk back across, even for $10, even for food you were going to buy anyway, next week regardless. The money consequence is a strange kind of discipline that has nothing to do with budgeting. You'll defend the round number itself far harder than you'll defend any actual financial goal sitting behind it, cutting things that genuinely don't matter while quietly ignoring things that do. Purely to protect the shape of the number showing on the screen, not the life the number is supposed to support. But the guarding doesn't stop at the first 1,000. It escalates the moment the number gets big enough to start feeling permanent. $10,000. This is where spending briefly, deceptively gets easier again. Where you're at dinner with your partner, somewhere a little nicer than usual, and the bill comes in about $110 over what you'd mentally budgeted for the evening. A year ago, this exact moment would have quietly ruined the rest of your night. Tonight, you barely register it, because $10,000 sitting behind you doesn't just cover the difference on paper, it makes the difference feel almost irrelevant emotionally, a rounded error against a number that finally feels solid instead of fragile and temporary. For the first time anywhere on this staircase, you're not running a survival calculation in the background. You're just having dinner actually present in the conversation instead of half present and doing math. This is cushion confidence. Once savings cross a threshold that could actually absorb a real emergency, A broken car, a lost month of income, a medical bill. The brain stops treating every purchase as a threat to survival, because survival is no longer genuinely at stake the way it was at 0 or at 1,000. This is the one honest window on the entire staircase where the fear mechanism briefly, correctly stands down, because the danger it'll evolve to guard against has actually been handled. The money consequence is that spending in this window is often the healthiest it will ever be for you across the entire staircase. Proportionate, occasionally generous, rarely regretted the next morning the way overspending at 0 often was. This isn't the version of you that needs fixing. This is the version of you the rest of this list is quietly working, in its own misguided way, to protect, whether it realizes that or not. But cushion confidence has a shelf life, and it expires the moment the number stops feeling like protection you earned and starts feeling like an achievement worth defending on its own, for its own sake, independent of what it can actually do for you. $50,000. This is the moment other people start noticing what you've built, and it changes something quiet in how you spend. You're looking at flights for a trip you've genuinely earned and can obviously afford. The upgrade to a better seat is $300 more than the basic fare. You open a calculator on your phone, not to check whether you can afford it, which you clearly can, but to see what that same $300 would become in 20 years if you invested it instead of spending it on legroom. You do this exact math for a plane seat, standing in an airport, holding up the line slightly. 2 years ago, you never used to do this kind of math for anything at all. This is opportunity cost paralysis. Once savings reach a size where compounding becomes visible and real to you, not theoretical, every purchase quietly turns into a competition against a future, richer version of yourself, one who could have had this exact money, grow untouched instead. The comparison isn't between the item and your bank balance anymore. It's between the item and 30 years of imagined compound interest, a competitor no plane seat, dinner, or jacket can ever realistically win against. The money consequence is a strange, specific kind of stinginess that has nothing to do with actually being broke, and everything to do with treating every dollar as a tiny permanent fork in the road towards some hypothetical future net worth. People at this level often describe feeling guiltier about small purchases than they did with a tenth of the money sitting in their account, which makes no logical sense at all until you see the exact mechanism running quietly underneath it, doing math nobody asked it to do. But this particular fear has an expiration date too, because once the number gets big enough, it stops being about growth entirely and starts being about something closer to identity. $100,000. Here's where the number stops being money you have and starts being someone you are. You've crossed 6 figures for the first time, and without ever deciding to, you've started introducing yourself, at least internally, as the kind of person who has 6 figures saved. A friend suggests a spontaneous weekend trip that would cost somewhere around $2,000 all in. You hesitate noticeably longer than the amount itself would ever justify, not because $2,000 threatens your survival or even your comfort in any real sense, but because some quiet part of you is running a strange internal question. Would the kind of person who has $100,000 saved really spend it this casually on something this frivolous this last minute? This is Milestone Identity Lock. Round, symbolic numbers like 100,000 stop functioning as balances and start functioning as identity markers, the same way a job title or relationship status does. Once that shift happens, spending isn't just a financial decision anymore. It's a referendum on whether you still qualify as the person you've quietly started believing yourself to be. Falling back below the milestone doesn't just cost money in this scenario, it costs you a small private demotion that nobody else will ever see or know about, but that you'll feel anyway. The money consequence is that purchases here get filtered through an identity test rather than a plain budget, which means perfectly reasonable spending sometimes gets quietly rejected, purely because it feels beneath or beside who this number has convinced you that you now are. And once an amount becomes part of your identity, the fear attached to it doesn't shrink as the number keeps growing. It grows right alongside it, $250,000. This is where you start being more afraid of going backward than you ever were of not moving forward. You check your portfolio during a genuinely rough week in the market, and the number that's usually a comfort has dropped to $230,000, still an enormous amount of money by any reasonable, honest measure. but you don't feel like someone with $230,000 sitting in an account. You feel specifically and immediately like someone who just lost $20,000, and within the hour you've quietly canceled a planned purchase that has absolutely nothing to do with the market, purely to compensate for a loss that technically hasn't even happened yet, that exists only on paper, only for this particular week. This is downgrade panic. Once you've held a peak number for long enough to treat it as your new normal, any drop below that peak registers in the brain as an actual loss, even if you're still sitting on more money than you've ever had in your life at any prior point. This is the same mechanism that makes losing something you already have feel far worse than never having gained it in the first place, except now it's running on your entire net worth instead of a single purchase, recalibrating constantly as the peak keeps shifting upward. The money consequence is spending decisions that respond to market noise instead of your actual life, cutting things you genuinely want and could easily afford over temporary numbers that will very likely recover within months, sometimes even weeks, long before the thing you canceled would have. But there's one more shift still ahead, and it's the strangest one on this entire staircase, because by the time you reach it, the fear stops being about the money at all. $500,000. This is the level from the very start of this video, the one where you sit in your car for 10 minutes deciding on a coffee. You're not deciding whether you can afford it. Of course you can. You're doing something stranger and quieter. You're checking, almost superstitiously, whether spending anything at all right now will disturb a number that has stopped feeling like a resource and started feeling like a shield. $500,000 isn't sitting there to be used anymore. It's sitting there to be a wall between you and every bad thing that could ever happen to you. And touching a wall, even lightly, even for a coffee, feels like weakening it. This is security object fusion. At this size, the number stops representing what it can buy and starts representing your safety itself, fused so completely with your sense of being okay that spending any of it registers physically as removing a brick from something load-bearing. This is why people with $500,000 can feel more anxious over a $40 dinner than they did at $10,000, where the fear had actually mostly gone quiet. The money didn't stop being enough. It stopped being money and started being armor. The money consequence is the strangest one on the entire staircase. Genuine, real wealth, sitting almost completely unused, defended so fiercely and so constantly that it provides almost none of the freedom it was originally saved up to create in the first place, back when the number was small enough to still feel like a resource instead of a wall. And that's the piece almost nobody tells you. The staircase doesn't end at relief. It ends here at the exact moment the thing you built to protect you starts needing protecting from you. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. None of what you just walked through across these 7 levels is a character flaw, and it's definitely not a sign that money broke you somewhere along the way. Every single one of those 7 mechanisms exists because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Protect whatever resource currently represents your safety at any size using whatever tools it has on hand. The problem was never that you started protecting your money. The problem is that nobody ever told you the target of that protection keeps quietly changing shape as the number grows, so you never notice the switch happening 7 separate times without your permission. Once you can actually name the mechanism running underneath a specific hesitation, in the moment it's happening, it loses most of its grip almost immediately. Not all of it, and not forever, but enough that you can pause and ask yourself a simple, genuinely useful question instead of just freezing. Is this fear protecting my actual future? Or is it just protecting the shape of a number on a screen? Those two things feel completely identical in the moment you're standing at the register or staring at a laptop or holding up a line at the airport. They are not the same thing at all. Here's the one concrete shift worth taking from all of this. Before your savings hit the next round number, the next 1,000, the next milestone, the next threshold that's going to want to fuse with who you are, decide in advance what that money's actual job is: an emergency fund, a house in 3 years, 10 years of runway, whatever it genuinely, specifically is for you, not just safety in the abstract. Write it down somewhere you'll actually see it again, not just think it once and forget it by dinner. A number with an assigned job resists becoming your identity, because it's already busy being something else, something more useful to you than a wall you're afraid to touch. You don't need to stop protecting your money entirely. You just need to make sure you actually know what you're protecting it from. But there's one more piece of this that this video hasn't touched at all, and it might explain more than every mechanism you just heard combined. You've just learned why spending changes at every level of savings, quietly, on the inside, where nobody else can see it. But there's a second, separate shift happening at the exact same time, out loud, in the world, that almost nobody talks about. It's what you say about your money, to your friends, your family, the people across the table from you, at each one of these same levels, and it doesn't move in the direction you'd expect either. Some levels make you go completely silent about money you'd have happily mentioned out loud a year earlier without a second thought. Other levels make you bring it up in conversations that had nothing to do with money in the first place, almost as if you couldn't help it. The pattern flips more than once on the way up, and it flips for reasons that have almost nothing to do with pride or modesty or manners. The explanations people usually reach for first, and almost always the wrong ones. That's the next one. And it might explain a lot about the people around you too.